Okay, hello and welcome to my talk where I'm looking into the role of plasmids and AMR on the success and expansion of clades and subclades within ST131 E. coli. So ST131, so this is a sequence type that's a major cause of E. coli bloodstream infections in Norway and many places in Europe and the Western world. In Norway, it's the fourth largest clone and it accounts for nearly 20% of the bloodstream infections caused by E. coli. It's recently emerged and has globally disseminated. It's described as a multi-drug resistant clone and accounts for nearly 60% of all CTXM positive bloodstream infection isolates, so those that have ESBLs. And when we published on the Norwegian genomic collection of bloodstream infections, it generated some discussion about whether AMR was driving the success of this clone or whether there were other factors involved. I really wanted to look into that further. The first thing to know about ST131 is that it's got four major clades. We have the green clade on the right, which is A, then B in yellow, C2 in orange, and C1 in blue. Second thing to note is that these four clades have completely different AMR profiles, with C2 being the most resistant, with 70% of the isolates being multi-drug resistant and having many of them having CTXM. Clade B is the opposite end of the spectrum with no multi-drug resistant isolates and predominantly pan-susceptible profile. But interestingly, all four lineages were part of the expansion in Norway and account for 20 to 30% of ST131 overall and have similar incidence in bloodstream infections. So we wanted to take a closer look at this problem and the expansions in AMR. As I said, that we'd published a genomic survey of Norwegian bloodstream and isolates, and from that we had 278 ST131 isolates. Those were mapped against an ST131 reference to create a recombination-free phylogeny with gubbins, dated, and then we inferred clonal expansions on that tree. We also had phenotypic AMR data, but we inferred AMR from the genome additionally. So Sergio has been working with long-read data on this Norwegian collection, and there are 268, which is just 10 short of all ST131, where there are both Illumina and long-read data, and he's been looking at plasmid assemblies across all of the collection. But we brought these two analyses together to take a look at the role of plasmids and where AMR is carried on the plasmid or on the chromosome to investigate what's driving the expansion of different clades. And that's the wrong way. So cave dive was the method that I used to have a look at the clonal expansions. This program doesn't assume that there was just one expansion across the whole tree, but looks at the branching pattern to see which clonal expansions may have occurred on different branches. And the input for that is backdating, and there were 7 probable expansions. And here we had the opportunity to look at AMR and plasmids associated with these specific branches where there was a high probability of an expansion. So if we look at clade A, we have the tree on the right here. The whole tree is shown for clade A, but then we have this probable expansion on this branch, in which most of clade A sits. We have ampicillin resistance across most of the tree. And we have an overrepresentation of ciprofloxacin resistant in the expanded part, along with CTXM positive isolates. However, these represent a number of independent acquisitions, and the most recent common ancestor was likely ampicillin resistant, but ciprofloxacin sensitive and CTXM negative, so it's unlikely to have driven the expansion on this branch. So we had a look at each of the 7 expansions. Each row in this table is a different expansion, and in the second column we have what kind of resistance profile that expansion group had, and what the context of that was, whether or not the closely related isolates shared that profile as well, to then decide whether there was a possible association with the expansion. So in clade B, there was one subclade, 20% of the isolates, where the dominant resistance profile was ampicillin resistance, and that had been a gain of ampicillin resistance compared to the other isolates of clade B, so it's possibly associated with this expansion. For clade C2, you had a subclade which represented all but one isolate. The dominant resistor was ampicillin, ciprofloxacin resistant with CTXM gene. CTXM gene was the major difference from between C2 and C1 that might have driven this expansion. So this is classed as possible. But only 2 of the 7 was there any possible association with the expansion. If we look at plasmids, it starts to get slightly more complicated. At first look, you would say clade C2 is a clade where the common ancestor is likely CTXM positive with CTXM15, which is in purple here, with some losses. And that possibly arrived on a single plasmid backbone. But actually, we have a number of different plasmid backbones within this clade, the most common being cluster 8 and cluster 35. But in addition to that, we also have data on whether the CTXM, what plasmid it was in, and whether or not it was chromosomally integrated. So there's a tendency within this chrome for the CTXM to become chromosomally integrated. But in addition, there are a number of different plasmids in which that are carrying the CTXM gene. If we take a look at clade C1, that's the blue here on the left, and with clade C2 in the orange here as context. There are 2 expansions related to C1, one at the branch leading to the entire clade, and one is a subclade representing a large proportion of the isolates. With the clade overall, you can see compared to C2 that there is a difference in plasmid content, that cluster 13 and 23 are both common in clade C1, which might be associated with the expansion. With regards to the other expansion, there's no clear structure in either plasmid content or AMR content that differs it from the rest of clade C1. At the bottom here, we have whether or not the CTXM, what the CTXM context was, and most of the time it's in a plasmid cluster 13, which is F1, A2, B2, also known as. And within that, we have several different CTXM types, alleles, being observed. So we have one plasmid backbone with multiple acquisitions of different CTXM alleles. To summarize the plasmids, again, we have the 7 different expansions listed here. The dominant plasmid profile, and then the context, is that the same as their most closely related ancestors or not? And when looking at that data, we can see that there's possibly 4 different expansions that are associated with plasmid acquisition, which is the majority of so 4 out of 7 and more than with the AMR. So to summarize, it's not as simple as a gain of an AMR gene in one context or mutation, e.g. in one plasmid backbone, that leads to success or the expansion of subclades within ST131. Independent acquisitions of AMR within the probable clonal expansions leads us to put forward the hypothesis that AMR follows success due to increased exposure or a change in exposure. And I just want to highlight again that the risk of further acquisitions of CTXM in the C1 plasmid F1A2B20 is high. The second key finding is that plasmids were associated with expansions more often than AMR was, and the hypothesis we put forward here to explore more is that plasmids allow success in a new niche, and AMR follows that success. So I'd like to thank a lot of people, including my fantastic boss, Yuka Karanda, and in particular, the Norwegian E. coli bloodstream infection study group that collated all the isolates that their genome sequenced with short read and long read data that make this study possible. Thank you very much for listening.